'Twas mercy brought me from my pagan land, taught my benighted soul to understand that there's a God, that there's a Savior too. Once I redemption neither sought nor knew. Some view our sable race with scornful eye. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train.
Phillis Wheatley wrote the poem On Being Brought from Africa to America in 1773.
And she starts it by basically saying, this is what you want me to say, that she's better off than she was in Africa. But then she turns it into a mirror to the prejudices of her audience.
What does it mean to live with sincerity? To write from a place of truth, even when the dominant culture assumes you can't? Phillis Wheatley's poetry gave voice to her inner world and lived experience, marked by faith and resilience.
Some people on both sides of the Atlantic began to point out the hypocrisy of Americans who were saying that they were enslaved by taxes and by oppressive government, being themselves holders of slaves.
Even as she gained the admiration of some of the most powerful people of her era, including George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, she was met with disbelief, most notably from Thomas Jefferson, who dismissed her work as beneath the dignity of criticism. Hello, friends. I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and this is Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. In today's episode, I'm joined by David Waldstreicher, a great American historian and author of The Odyssey of Phillis Wheatley, a poet's journeys through American slavery and independence. We explore Wheatley's life and legacy. We'll also hear from filmmaker Ken Burns, who shares his thoughts on the redemptive act of choosing to uplift other people rather than diminish them. In the fall of 1772, 18 men, acclaimed as the most respectable characters in Boston, determined that Phillis Wheatley had, in fact, written her own poems. The panel of examiners included, among others, Thomas Hutchison, the colonial governor of Massachusetts, and John Hancock, who would soon become president of the Continental Congress. A London printer agreed to publish a collection of Wheatley's poems, but only after a group of white authorities first confirmed their authenticity. The panel was convened by John Wheatley, a Boston merchant who had purchased Phillis when she arrived in Boston Harbor on the slave ship Phillis in 1761. His wife Susanna was a follower of the evangelical minister George Whitefield. Although a defender of slavery, Whitefield preached to the enslaved and campaigned against cruel treatment. Inspired by Whitefield's spirit, Susanna began teaching 7-year-old Phillis alongside her own children. Here's David Waldstreicher.
She very quickly impressed the Wheatleys, showing a great interest in reading and writing. And by about the age of 13 and 14, she was composing elegies, poems for occasions that started to get the interest of people in Boston. And within a few years, she was publishing them in newspapers, and her poems were being passed around. And by 1770, she was famous on both sides of the Atlantic, initially for her elegy on George Whitefield, and also for showing that a person of African descent could master the highest and most popular forms of writing.
Hail, happy saint, on thy immortal throne. To thee, complaints of grievance are unknown. We hear no more the music of thy tongue. Thy wonted auditories cease to throng. Thy lessons in unequal accents flowed, while emulation in each bosom glowed. Thou didst, in strains of eloquence refined, inflame the soul and captivate the mind. Unhappy we, the setting sun deplore, which once was splendid, but it shines no more. He leaves this earth for heaven's unmeasured height, and worlds unknown receive him from our sight. There Whitfield wings with rapid course his way, and sails to Zion through vast seas of day.
Her work became both increasingly responsive to current events and politics in the lead up to the revolution, and also deeply moving to many people for the way it touched on religious themes and personal themes, and also gradually and very carefully the problem of slavery. So she became herself a symbol of both what was possible in terms of progress in the 1770s and 80s, and whether there might be a future that was not enslaved for Africans in America.
As you write, she shows curiosity for books and is taught to read and write by her mistress, Susanna, and her daughter. Tell us about her remarkable education and its influence on her poetry.
The fact that she is taking on so much of contemporary culture, yes, it's a deep piety and interest in religion that she might well have gotten from the Wheatleys, who were very involved in evangelical circles and supporters of Reverend Whitfield on his visits to the colonies. So there's an intentionality on the part of some of the circles that the Wheatleys are connected to educate some Africans in order to evangelize and in order to provide a kind of counterweight to what they see as the negative effects of the slave trade and the neglect of Native peoples and Africans by Christians, which they feel puts a whole damper on the religious justifications for the colonial project. So that's a big part of how it is as she becomes educated. The Wheatleys want her to be educated to spread the gospel, but clearly in her deep interest in the classics and her responsiveness to political things that are going on, she's clearly reading everything and just a sponge for all the very creative as well as political writing that is going on in highly literate Boston. Some of the young people, especially young girls that she knew in Boston, daughters of ministers, were also writing poetry, also highly literate, not always publishing, because more than half of the women who published poetry in the 18th century did so anonymously or circulated their poems widely, but without having them in print. So this was a very common thing. It also leads to the likelihood that she wrote a lot of poems that she didn't sign and that were never published, which wasn't because they weren't good, but just because she didn't have the occasion to publish them, or she decided not to include them in her first book, but save them for her second. If you're a fan of contemporary British literature, you're also a fan of the classics. You're reading Alexander Pope's poems. You're also reading Alexander Pope's translations of Homer and many others. She is really very typical of what's going on in literate and popular culture. So you see echoes of Isaac Watts' popular hymns in her poetry. You also see echoes and riffs on Pope's translations. And when I say riffs, I mean literally there are lines that she is adapting and quoting or rephrasing from Pope's Homer, which has sometimes been used to say that she's derivative or imitative, but that's what all the writers are doing this, both quoting directly and also riffing on this literature, riffing on John Milton, who himself is riffing on biblical and earlier poets. So as scholars like Eric Slaughter have pointed out, there's a culture of imitation that when you do that, you're showing you're learning and you're showing you're part of a conversation. And it's not like we would consider it plagiarism and unvirtuous. It's quite the opposite. The way literary culture works at this time, if it's pious to quote the Bible and show your knowledge and study of it, and virtuous to do that, it's also virtuous to be mindful of what other writers who have been doing the same thing have been doing and be nodding to them and showing that you expect your audience to be familiar with them. When she writes poems about virtue, and she even is talking about herself as virtuous, she's also connecting with literate people who are doing self-examination and thinking about virtue both as an aspect of the self and as an aspect of how you behave in a community and in a political community.
No more, America, in mournful strain of wrongs and grievance unredressed complain. No longer shall thou dread the iron chain, which wanton tyranny with lawless hand had made, and with it meant enslave the land.
That's Phillis Wheatley in a poem addressing the second Earl of Dartmouth, the British Secretary of State for the Colonies. She connects Americans' desire to be free from enslavement by Britain to her own desire to be free from enslavement by Americans.
So we might think of Wheatley as someone who uses the opening that evangelicalism presents to become literate in order to then leverage that to be part of larger political conversations. So it may start with religious stuff about virtue that tends to be biblical, and then to this, what we might think of more political questions of virtuous citizenship. And so by the time we get to the early 1770s, she is referring to herself as someone who is self-consciously watching public events and thinking about their implications for good conduct and for justice, and that she is able to enter into that conversation about virtue, even without hiding the fact that she's a woman and an African. And if anything, self-consciously being aware that her audience is always aware of it. And rather than hiding behind anonymity the way that many writers do and many women writers do, she doesn't have that luxury, though I think she does actually experiment with it, with some anonymous stuff in newspapers. She's actually able to kind of leverage the surprise or presumptions of her audience to say some quite original thing and make some connections between the problems of how do you behave as an ethical person in controversial politics and the problem of what it means for a woman and a Black person to participate. All that has big political implications as we enter a revolutionary moment.
You explore so powerfully the connection for Wheatley between personal virtue and political virtue, and you analyze her poem on being brought from Africa to America. It's been critiqued for generations as seeming to be thankful for enslavement, but you show her irony and her true intent, which is exactly the opposite.
Yes, it's been a very gradual evolution for me in terms of how to think about that poem as one that is deeply challenging to its audience. And I think I'm going along with other scholarship on this. It isn't only me, but in many ways, it's central, really, to my book, and not least because the whole idea for the book started with my experience of teaching that poem and seeing my students at Temple University react to it in such diametrically opposed ways. I found myself in talking about the poem recently being even bolder than I am in the book, in arguing the poem is a response to her being asked who the hell she is and what it is she's doing. And in the context of being quite aware of people wanting her to say that she's grateful for being enslaved, and that she's better off because they're not Christian in Africa, and better off because Africa is conceived of in a very self-serving way by racists, but also by a lot of well-meaning Christians as a terrible place that is to blame for the slave trade. Look, they all sell their countrymen, so anything has got to be better than that. So it's a fortunate fall, was the term that was being used. And so she starts it by basically saying, this is what you want me to say. Then she turns it into a mirror to the prejudices of her audience. Some say we're diabolic. Their color is a diabolic dye. Remember, Christians, Negroes, black as Cain, may be refined and join the angelic train. So you guys have this obsession with color that you associate with evil and deviltry, but that's just a bunch of racist claptrap. So even by your own condescending standards and your own evangelical project, you're being hypocritical in the way you're approaching me, and as well as all the other Africans. So that's what I think's going on there in those 8 lines. And the early proposal for her volume, she dates some of the poems, and she dates that one in 1768. But we see no sign of it, which isn't proof positive, but still no sign of it until her book in 1773. So is she like tinkering with it for 5 years? It comes after the introductory poem to Maecenas, in which she argues that she can be in this classical train of great writers, that an African can be there. And then she establishes her piety in the next poems. And so it's after that that then she can say, okay, here I'm going to show you where this is going. It's as part of a narrative. It's as part of a larger body of poems so that it's not misinterpreted.
In the summer of 1773, with the support of an aristocratic woman who sponsored the publication of slave narratives, Wheatley visited a London publisher. She was accompanied by the son of her enslaver. While at sea, the publicity campaign for her book hit the press. Quote, "The book here proposed for publication displays perhaps one of the greatest instances of pure unassisted genius that the world ever produced." In London, she met a plethora of leaders, including a British anti-slavery campaigner, the future Lord Mayor of London, and Benjamin Franklin, who was living there for nearly 2 decades as an agent for the American colonies. Thanks to a 1772 judicial decision, which was widely viewed as ending slavery in England, Phillis couldn't have been forced to return to America against her will. She agreed to return to the Wheatleys to care for an ailing Susanna, possibly in exchange for a promise that the family would free her on her arrival. Whatever their motives, John and Susanna Wheatley did indeed grant Phillis her freedom by October 18, 1773, a month after her return to Boston.
Proceed, great chief, with virtue on thy side. Thy every action let the goddess guide. A crown, a mansion, and a throne that shine. With gold, unfading, Washington, be thine.
Wheatley's genius was recognized not only by Franklin, but by the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. In October 1775, 6 months into the Revolutionary War, Phillis wrote a poem for George Washington, who replied gratefully. A colonel in the army arranged for it to be published. Encouraged by Washington's endorsement, Wheatley continued to write poetry, suggesting that the Revolution would end all forms of enslavement in America. Thomas Jefferson also acknowledged Phillis Wheatley, writing in Notes on the State of Virginia in response to questions about America posed by the French legation.
I might preface this by saying I'm a graduate of the University of Virginia. I've been thinking about Jefferson and race for a long, long time. And I actually think that Jefferson can't resist Wheatley. Wheatley's like his kryptonite. The key question, I think, about Jefferson bringing up Wheatley in order to dismiss her in Notes on the State of Virginia, in a passage where he's advancing it as a scientific hypothesis that Africans are not the equal of white people, there's been this ongoing debate about whether the New World is a site of progress or degeneracy, that he is engaging in this natural history of Virginia, and that those sets of arguments have come to overlap with the emerging debate about whether slavery is natural for some people or whether it's an injustice, an artifact of politics and oppression. And he's quite aware that people like Ignatius Sancho and other Blacks who have done mathematics, Blacks who have done poetry, are being used as examples to suggest that it's nurture, not nature, that explains why there haven't been Black geniuses or who have written books. And he knows that Wheatley has been used for more than a decade by the time he's writing in the 1780s as a counterexample. So that's why he's going after Wheatley. And it's precisely because Jefferson loved poetry, he loved classics, he loved Homer. So it's not an accident that he makes arguments, for example, that Homer and the slaves that Homer talks about in the Odyssey, he claims were white, not Africans. And this is completely against Wheatley pointing out in her book of poems. In the first poem, she says, well, I can do this because Terence, the Roman poet, was a great poet, and he was African by birth, so that means he was Black, so I'm not the first, I'm in this tradition too. And he also says that Wheatley's poetry is not very good and that religion could produce a Phillis Wheatley, but it could not produce a poet. And I think of Jefferson as having kind of tried out this at the equivalent of cocktail parties. He runs it up the flagpole and it gets a laugh, and it just sort of dismisses her and her whole project and says that she's just religious and thus she's not classical and that she's not really doing what she's doing. So he kind of buries it in a paragraph, but it's actually quite essential to the larger argument of the whole chapter. Jefferson knows slavery is wrong. He wants it to disappear eventually, but he also knows that it's being used against the Americans at a time when they're deeply in need of European investment and French support. And so he's writing to people in Europe about explaining Virginia and its history to them. And what he wants to say is, we're really anti-slavery. The British made us keep the slave trade going. It's not good for Virginia. And this is what he says in that other short chapter on manners. But we've injured the Africans so much, there's no way we can live together. So they need to go be resettled somewhere else. So what he wants to do is have his theoretical anti-slavery, but without emancipating people and admitting Black equality. So he ends up with this kind of political racism, which is so toxic and dangerous, but he only does it because he knows slavery is wrong. And I think we often miss that. And the reason he doesn't just ignore Wheatley is because of her significance, that he has to deal with her in order to try to recalibrate the political moment in which she and some of her allies are deconstructing race and in the process delegitimizing slavery. And he wants to drive those questions apart. So however racist he was on our standpoint, that's really not as important as the fact that the whole reason he's doing it is to try to think of himself as not really being a believer in slavery while not having to pay the political price personally in Virginia or internationally for America that a real anti-slavery politics would require.
Phillis Wheatley died at age 31, a year before Jefferson wrote about her in Notes on the State of Virginia. She'd lost 3 infants, her husband was plagued with debt and abandoned her, and John Wheatley, her former enslaver, left her nothing in his will.
While deep you mourn beneath the cypress shade, the hand of death and your dear daughter laid, in dust whose absence give your tears to flow, and racks your bosom with incessant woe. Let recollection take a tender part, assuage the raging tortures of your heart, still the wild tempest of tumultuous grief, and pour the heavenly nectar of relief.
That's a eulogy for a young woman from Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral, by Phillis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston in New England in 1773. When we return, I'll talk with Ken Burns about how the way we treat others reveals something deeper about the sincerity in our own character. This is Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness. I'm Jeffrey Rosen. Earlier this year, filmmaker Ken Burns and I discussed the founders and the enduring moral lessons they offer. We explored the ways that sincerity begins with self-examination and the courage to acknowledge our own flaws before casting judgment on others.
And I think what sincerity suggests is that to thine own self be true. You have to actually manifest and represent who you are and what you believe to the best of your ability. But you also have to understand that sincerity requires a kind of pause that gives you an opportunity to reflect. You can see that in siblings that grow up close in age to one another, my brother and me, who squabbled all the time, a little bit of mitigating circumstances given the desperate sadness of our childhood. But it's always the thing that the other person does. You can see a child with another child, like a toddler, 2 years old, and the friend is over, and the friend starts to play with a toy that's not being played with. And it just drives the person crazy because they want that. My mother used to say, don't be a dog in the manger. And so I think that one of the primary obligations of us in order to remain kind of true to who we are is to absorb the stuff that happens, to have a thick skin. I remember my mother told me also that when somebody criticizes you, there's probably a little grain of truth in it. She was a very religious person. And I always remember that. I developed pretty much of a thick skin, but early in my life when somebody might give a bad review of a film and I'd be upset about it, I'd often realize that it wasn't me they were talking about. It was themselves. And that was an interesting liberation to have. And at the same time, by controlling my own reaction, then I wasn't engaged in this completely foolhardy exercise in which things just begin to devolve between human beings. I like the idea that our obligation is to bear the unpleasant manifestations of the other and to watch what happens. It is liberating to let go of the prisons of that negativity or that judgment of the other. And in fact, it does nothing to them. It only does it to you. These are all corroding the vessel that they're contained in. Like if I look down at you, I have disrupted any possibility of communication. If you look up to me or vice versa, there's no possibility. If we come to each other with equanimity and equality, then anything is possible. And that's the nature of it. And too often it is simpler to make an imbalance. That way people can be dismissed and other people can be exalted to be tilted towards. And it's usually towards the material wealth, the dissipation of the body, the idleness, and all of the things that actually deliver you away from the happiness that we supposedly all seek. And not realizing that we're not promised it. It's something you work towards. You'll never achieve it. And that there will be the inevitable vicissitudes of life will visit us all. And we are measured by how we then respond to those vicissitudes.
Adieu, New England's smiling meads. Adieu, the flowery plain. I leave thine opening charms, O spring, and tempt the roaring main.
How do you define sincerity in your own life? John Milton, the great poet of the English Revolution and author of Paradise Lost, wrote a sonnet about how he urged his fellow Englishmen to think for themselves rather than obeying official doctrine. But they ignored his advice and still revolt when truth would set them free. In 1776, John Adams quoted Milton's sonnet and acknowledged Milton's influence on Adams' thoughts on government, along with other great writers, including Algernon Sidney and John Locke. All of those writers demonstrated, according to Adams, that all good government is republican, for the true idea of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men. I also quoted Milton's sonnet in the following song and wrote it in the same meter, which is called ottava rima. That's A-B, 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 C-C. I wrote it on the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, and it's about the Quaker injunction to be true to the light within. Here's baritone James Martin singing The Light Within with Jennifer Blythe at the piano.
I sit upon a cliff beside the sea and watch the sun arise above the waves. I hear the seagulls singing peacefully and feel the wind that tossed the ancient graves. Sun blazing through the clouds astonishes me. I feel the light that everybody craves. Each sunrise when I watch the day begin, I liberate the sacred light within. Each sunrise when I watch the day begin, I liberate the sacred light within. Each sunrise when I watch the day begin, I liberate the sacred light within. I did not prompt the age to quit their clogs, banishing their monkish superstition, abandon the church and synagogues that laughed the earnest seeker to derision. The eternal truth like casting pearls to hogs, concealed in those who seek another's vision. Cast off the dogma and you'll soon begin to liberate the sacred light within. Each sunrise when I watch the day begin, I liberate the sacred light within. Each sunrise when I watch the day begin, I liberate the sacred light within.
Thanks for listening, friends. I'm thrilled that my new book is out in October 2025. It's called The Pursuit of Liberty: How Hamilton versus Jefferson Ignited the Lasting Battle Over Power in America. Please order online or check it out at a bookstore near you. Pursuit, The Founder's Guide to Happiness, is produced by PRX Productions for the National Constitution Center. From PRX, the team is Genevieve Sponsler, Courtney Florentine, David Newtown, Sandra Lopez Monsalve, Tommy Bazarian, and Pedro Rafael Rosado. The executive producer of PRX Productions is Jocelyn Gonzalez. The voice actor for Phillis Wheatley is Amber Walker. From the NCC, our team is Annie Stone, Griffin Ritchie, and Bill Pollack. Music and lyrics by Jeffrey Rosen, with arrangements by Greg Stroman. The songs and incidental music feature baritone James Martin, with Jennifer Blythe at the piano, and Greg Stroman on trombone for the theme song. I'm Jeffrey Rosen. In our next episode, The Life of George Washington, with historian Ed Larson. This podcast was made possible with the support of the John Templeton Foundation.